Does immigration increase when Democrats are in charge? I became interested in this topic because while I'm filming this video, it is all over the news that some governors of Republican states are sending either plane loads full or bus loads full of immigrants to other locations in the country that are Democrat controlled. When these governors are justifying their decision to send immigrants to other states, they very often claim that Democrat policies are increasing immigration. So basically, if Democrats want immigrants so badly, then they should have them. A statement from Ron DeSantis's office says this: states like Massachusetts, New York, and California will better facilitate the care of these individuals who they have invited into our country by incentivizing illegal immigration through their designation as sanctuary states and support for the Biden administration's open border policies. Or you can check out this statement from Texas Governor Greg Abbott, who says the Biden-Harris administration continues ignoring and denying the historic crisis at our southern border, which has endangered and overwhelmed Texas communities for almost 2 years. From these statements, you can see that Republican governors are quick to blame Democrats for immigration. They say that immigration is Democrats' fault. But is it? Do Democrat policies actually increase immigration while Republican policies decrease immigration? That was my question. You can see a lot of yahoos on the internet claiming that that's true, but I wanted to look at real peer-reviewed research on the question and find out, do Republicans and Democrats' different immigration policies actually create differences in the amount of immigration? First, let's look at the political divide itself and establish that Democrats and Republicans do, in fact, have different approaches to immigration. You can see this difference among politicians. Democrat politicians are generally more pro-immigration, and Republican politicians, as a general rule, are more anti-immigration. Researchers have found that during the 1940s, 50s, 60s, politicians used to play up a divide between blacks and whites, but now politicians are more likely to play up a divide between Hispanics and whites. And while not all Hispanics are immigrants, a lot of politicians talk this way as though when they talk about Hispanics, they're talking about immigrants, and when they talk about immigrants, they're talking about Hispanics. That isn't actually true. A lot of immigrants are not Hispanic, and a lot of Hispanics are not immigrants, but that is how a lot of politicians talk about the issue. Researchers have found that when media is talking about immigration and presenting it as a problem, they're a lot more likely to quote Republican officials and politicians. There's an assumption that a lot of people have that Democrat politicians are more pro-immigrant because immigrants are more likely to vote Democrat, but it turns out that assumption isn't completely true. High-skilled immigrants are more likely to vote Democrat, but low-skilled immigrants are more likely to vote Republican. And this holds true even when you consider the immigrant's country of origin or their race. So the idea that Democrat politicians are just trying to get immigrants to vote for them may be sort of kind of true, but it's not completely holding water. There is also a political divide among voters. In 2017, research found that the Democrat Party is only about 60% white, with the other 40% being made up of Blacks, Hispanics, and Asians. In contrast, the Republican Party is about 90% white. So as time goes on, the Republican Party is being increasingly defined by whiteness. Now that we've established that Republicans and Democrats do have different ideas about immigration, here's a question. Do those different policies and opinions and approaches, do they matter? First, we're going to look at the local level. Do local immigration politics matter? Some researchers looked at 3,200 different sheriffs across the United States. All of these sheriffs were elected, so they campaigned on being either Democrat or Republican sheriffs. And the question was, at the local level, does it make a difference in immigration policy enforcement if your sheriff is a Republican or if your sheriff is a Democrat? The results were no, it makes no difference at all. What they found is that sheriffs of both political parties did mostly enforce immigration policies. Even when they actually had the legal ability to just use their own judgment and decide to not enforce in some situations, they almost always did. The next question from the local level was asking if a business is caught employing lots of undocumented workers, what happens next? Does what happens next depend on whether the local officials are Democrat or Republican? In that case, they did find some difference. When local officials were Democrat and when Democrats were holding a majority in Congress, then local businesses were more likely to be charged less in fines for having undocumented immigrants. In contrast, when local officials were Republican and when Republicans held a majority in Congress, then local businesses were likely to be charged more in fines for having undocumented immigrants. I also found that at the local level, there is evidence that immigration policies can affect specific industries or businesses. For example, the dairy industry was negatively affected by a policy that's called 287G here in the United States. A lot of undocumented immigrants who had been working in the dairy industry quit when this policy came into effect because the policy allowed for more raids on those businesses. However, there was no evidence that this immigration policy actually encouraged people to leave the United States. They probably went and worked in other businesses. So there is evidence that strict immigration policies can hurt businesses, but there isn't a lot of evidence that strict immigration policies are keeping immigrants out at the local level. Next, let's look at state immigration policies. Using data from 2005 to 2010, there was a study that identified immigration drivers in the United States. What they found was that state immigration policies had no effect at all on immigration. In fact, I'll go ahead and quote from this study for you here. State immigration policies seem to function as symbolic overtures with very little or no actual policy output. So in plain English, what these researchers found is that state immigration policies are being used by politicians to look like they're anti-immigration or pro-immigration, but there's very little or no evidence that these policies actually change how much people immigrate. I found other research that asked the question, which states do immigrants move to? As I was looking at this research, I expected that probably immigrants would be more likely to move to states that had more favorable immigrant policies and be less likely to move to states that had harsher immigration policies. But there was no evidence of that at all. Here's what researchers actually found. Immigrants are much more likely to go to states that border the Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, or the Gulf Coast. They're more likely to move to states where the median family income is higher. They're more likely to move to states where the average January temperature is higher. They're more likely to move to states where the percentage of Hispanics is higher, and states that have more economic freedom. Immigrants are less likely to go to states with higher costs of living. So there is nothing in that list that indicates that immigrants are choosing Democrat-controlled states and moving away from Republican-controlled states. That's just not how immigrants are making their decisions. So now let's look on the national level. Do national immigration politics matter when determining how much immigration there will be? I did find research that looks at this question globally. The researcher looked at 33 OECD countries. Those are generally richer countries that immigrants want to go to, and also examined 170 countries that were poorer, that were generally the sorts of countries that immigrants were moving away from. This researcher tried to figure out if, on a global scale, immigration policies matter. Do countries that have more liberal immigration policies actually get more immigrants? And this researcher found that yes, in fact, that is true. Countries that have more restrictive immigration policies have fewer immigrants. So that definitely is true if you look at the broad global picture, looking mostly at countries in Europe. But then there's the next question: is that actually true in the United States? There are good reasons to think that the immigration picture in the United States might be very different than the immigration picture in Europe. The United States is a lot bigger geographically than most of the countries in Europe. It has much longer borders than most of the other countries in Europe. And the groups of people who are immigrating to the United States are very different than the groups of people who are immigrating into Europe. So just because it's true in Europe doesn't mean it's going to be true for the United States. Researchers have tested this idea in the United States. Do national immigration policies change the level of immigration in the United States? For example, one researcher looked at a particular case study of the summer of 2014. There was an influx of women and children at the U.S. border, mostly coming from El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. It was widely covered in national news, and it was seen by most people as a crisis. Obama asked Congress to appropriate $3.7 billion in funding to help stem the tide of people at the border. The funding did all kinds of things, including enhancing border security, creating new beds, lots of new beds in prisons to detain families in. They created media campaigns in home countries telling people, if you think you're going to be welcome in the United States, you won't be. Don't try to come here. They also funneled money toward countries like Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras to help turn around asylum seekers before they ever got to the border. All of this was in addition to the border policies that were already in place, including raids, family detention, and interdiction. Researchers found no deterrent effect at all. The number of migrants dropped temporarily in the early part of 2015, but then after that very temporary effect, the number of migrants steadily climbed and ended up reaching higher levels than they had before this border enforcement. And there is no evidence that this temporary drop in migrants had anything at all to do with U.S. policy. Most researchers who study this issue claim that U.S. border enforcement is a complete and total failure. It has done absolutely nothing to curb immigration. There is very little or no evidence at all that when border enforcement goes up, immigration goes down, or that when border enforcement goes down, immigration goes up. It's just not making any difference at all. There is some research that indicates that in the 1970s and 80s, maybe U.S. immigration policy did make a difference in the number of immigrants, but even that research should be taken with a caveat. For one thing, that was a while ago and the situation has changed. But even then, researchers couldn't find very strong evidence that U.S. immigration policy actually changed the number of immigrants. At best, the evidence was weak, even then, and that was 40 and 50 years ago. The number one factor that changes immigration rates is the economy. People are generally coming here for jobs. When the U.S. economy goes up, immigration goes up. When the U.S. economy goes down, immigration goes down. During the big recession of like 2008, 2009, Immigration ended up decreasing so dramatically that the number of people leaving the United States was the same as the people coming into the United States. So it ended up being a net zero change because the economy was so bad. Migration numbers are extremely sensitive to wage differences between the United States and the migrant's home country. Every time those wage differences change so that wages are higher in the United States, migration increases. And whenever the economy changes so that wages are a bit lower or the difference isn't as dramatic between the United States and the home country, then migration decreases. So here's one last question to ponder. Why? Why doesn't strict enforcement make any difference? One thing that researchers say is that immigration laws are imperfectly enforced. Researchers have been able to document that when border security increases in one location where there are lots of immigrants crossing, it will very temporarily, we're talking about for a week, maybe a couple of weeks, maybe a whole month, it will very temporarily decrease immigration, but then migrants just start going around. They start going to another location. In locations that have border walls, people will fly over the border or they will dig tunnels underneath the border. People always find a way around. Border Patrol claims that they just cannot stop all the immigration because it's just such a flood of people, they can't possibly enforce the immigration rules in the United States. Some researchers believe them. Other researchers are a lot more skeptical. There are two main ways that the US government could enforce immigration laws. One is Border Patrol, and the second is by stopping companies that employ undocumented immigrants within the United States. The majority of the immigration enforcement budget goes to the border. But researchers point out that it's actually a lot easier and more effective to find people who are already working undocumented in the United States and to punish their employers and send them to their home countries again. They're easier to find. They're usually just in one location. The sectors of the economy that employ the most undocumented immigrants are well established. If immigration enforcement officers really were wanting to decrease the number of undocumented immigrants in the United States, they would go after the employers who hire undocumented immigrants, because that strategy would be easier, cheaper, and more effective. However, multiple papers that I read pointed out that employers can put a lot of political pressure on their politicians to make sure that these kinds of raids and fines for them when they hire undocumented workers don't happen. So immigration enforcement ends up targeting the people who are crossing the border because they're more vulnerable and it's harder for them to fight back, instead of targeting the people who are already in the United States and working undocumented or their employers. It's all about who has the political power. Overall, researchers have found that increased border security has little or no effect at all on the number of immigrants who actually arrive in the United States. So let's summarize what we've learned here. It is absolutely true that Democrat politicians usually talk big about being pro-immigrant, and Republican politicians usually talk big about being anti-immigrant. However, there is no evidence at all at the local level, at the state level, or the federal level that political differences actually change the number of immigrants. Why doesn't stricter enforcement make a difference? Well, the people who are migrating usually find a way around Border Patrol, but there's also an argument to be made that Border Patrol isn't the most effective way to enforce these laws, and our country is selectively deciding to enforce the laws in the least effective way possible, probably because of political pressure.